Get ready to see an evolutionary biologist school a creationist right now. So this is Dr. Zack Hancock, and he's an evolutionary biologist, and he has a YouTube channel that's really cool. I've often encountered his videos when I'm looking up something about evolution, and I'm a creationist. I have an extreme bias against evolution, and I have a religious agenda. Here it is. So Dr. Hancock has a job to do tonight because I'm a tough cookie when it comes to evolution, but I want to be open-minded. So I have invited him, and he is graciously sharing his time to come and share what he believes is good evidence for evolution. So welcome, Dr. Hancock. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Excited to chat. I hope I can match your energy. So as Rebekah said, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I've been doing this for a little over 10 years at this point. So I'm fully indoctrinated into it, I guess is maybe how Rebekah would put it. So I got my PhD from Texas A&M University. I worked in ecology and evolution. That was like literally what my PhD was. I mostly focused on amphipod crustaceans. If you don't know what those are, you might know what roly-polies are, very cute little things called pill bugs. Amphipods are their sister species. They're their closest relative. And I worked on sort of their phylogenetics, how they're all related to each other, what their species level relationships are, looked at some biogeographic patterns of how those species complexes formed. And I did a lot of genomics. So I was really interested in differences in genome sizes in amphipods. They have wildly different genome sizes, and maybe we can talk about that sort of thing as we go forward. But I was really fascinated by that in grad school. So then afterwards, I went and did a postdoc at the University of Michigan, where I was for 4 years doing statistical population genetics, which maybe for a lot of people, that might be a bit of a snooze fest. It's just a lot of math, a lot of statistics, but maybe of use to this conversation is it is really sort of the mathematical foundation of evolutionary biology, right? It might come as a surprise to many people, but evolutionary theory at its very core is a mathematical discipline, more so than any of the other life sciences, and definitely rivaled only by physics. So I'd be very excited to talk about that as well. And since then, I am now a sort of a teaching professor here in Georgia at Augusta University, where I hope to keep doing some evolutionary biology, probably focused in marine organisms. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I don't know what direction you want to start or how you want to take this, Rebekah. I'll leave it to you to either ask the first question or set the direction you'd like to go.
Well, what are some of the things that cause you to believe that evolution is true? Like what is convincing evidence for you?
Convincing evidence. So this is and I knew you were going to ask this question, and this is sort of a difficult thing for me to pin down any one single thing. And I don't even mean that in like because there's so much way. I mean it in that over the course of 10 years, like the way I think about science, the way I approach science, and the way that I think about biology has just changed over that course. So like when I first started off, I was like, how is evolution? How do I know evolution is true? And those of you that don't know me, I actually grew up a Southern Baptist. I was raised in like a creationist household. I read Whitcomb and Morris's Genesis Flood when I was in high school. Like I was really into that, and I argued a lot when I was young. So when I first started reading into evolution, that's kind of the way that I thought. It's what's the evidence for evolution sort of thing. But as I've progressed, I've become way more interested in process-based science and in using sort of the methods and the predictive abilities of evolution to help me understand what I should see and what I will find in nature, and then being kind of amazed when I find it, right? So it's the kind of predictive power of evolution that I've always found the most moving, or that I presently find the most moving. But to not sidestep your question and give us potentially some biology to talk about, what I found most compelling, especially when I was younger, and this is a thing people don't talk about as much anymore, and it's a shame, but I really found things like vestigial structures and atavisms. So these sorts of things that, for the audience sake, those who don't know what atavisms are, there's these ideas that these primitive characters in organisms are capable of reappearing because they still exist as like remnants in the genome, and then mutations can reawaken them, right? So some traits that were present in our ancestors that are no longer present today.
Can you give an example?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Of an atavism or of a vestigial?
Yeah, an atavism.
An atavism. So one of the kind of classic ones, and I think the ones that maybe most people are familiar with, are, so all cetaceans lack hind limbs, right? They don't have back legs. They only have front legs. So those are dolphins, whales, those sorts of things. But in development, they actually will form hind limb buds. They will form just the same as they will the forelimbs, but then most of the time, before development is complete, they get reabsorbed. Right? They get rid of those hind limbs, and then they're not actually born with hind limbs. However, occasionally that process messes up and they don't reabsorb those hind limbs, and you will get dolphins born with these kind of funny little vestigial back limbs, right? And we got like several examples of this. It's kind of kooky. But that's sort of the classic one, I think, are like these kinds of atavisms in cetaceans.
Okay. And you mentioned that there's like some things that you've noted, like the predictive power that has inspired you. So what things did you look for, and then were you excited when you found?
Yeah, so one of the big things are understanding differences in why genome size vary across the tree of life. So this is something that's really fascinating to me. So humans, we only have 3 billion letters in our sort of DNA rung. If you lay our DNA out end to end and you count all the little letters in the rung of DNA, the nucleotides, we have about 3 billion. And the human population actually varies in this. It varies from like 2.9 to about 3.2. So me and Rebekah might have like 100 million base pair difference in our genome size. It is variable. But across the tree of life, it varies wildly, right? So bacteria have tiny little bitty genomes, only a few megabases, that's a few million bases, all the way up to things like lungfish that have hundreds of gigabases, so billions of bases, much, much larger than ours. And as I mentioned at the start, the amphipods that I study had a genome that's 14 gigabases. That's 14 billion bases, and it's about that big. And it lives on sandy beaches. And one of the things is like, why? Right? Like what does this little dude need 14 billion DNA bases for? Why is that the case? And so I was thinking, okay, what does evolutionary theory tell us? Like what could I predict coming from an evolutionary perspective about why these guys would have such big genomes? And it turns out a couple of their relatives have much smaller genomes, so only about 2 gigabases. So then the question is, okay, genome sizes bloat mostly by parasitic DNA. Right? If you look at the differences between organisms, what they differ in is transposable content. Right, so organisms have largely different, or a very large difference in the amount of transposable elements that they have, and that generally predicts differences in genome size. If transposable elements are mostly junk, right, if they're mostly nonsense and they mostly spread through populations in a semi-deleterious way like parasites, then what you would expect is organisms that have less efficient selection. So natural selection is not powerful enough to get rid of that stuff. Those organisms should have bigger genomes on average than organisms that have stronger selection, that can see those little things and get rid of them, right? So that's the sort of prediction, that's the idea. Well, how would you distinguish those two hypotheses? Well, the idea is that organisms with larger population sizes are the ones where selection is more efficient, right? So bigger populations, more efficient selection. Smaller populations, less efficient selection. And so the prediction would be, if I go out and I look at these different populations of shovel bugs, they're called shovel bugs, that's the name that we give them, then what I should find is that the ones with the biggest population has the smallest genome, and the ones with the smallest population has the biggest genome. Right, and that's just really simplistic. It's a little bit more of a fine-tuned correlation than that, but that's just like a sort of simple hypothesis that one could test. And sure enough, when you go into nature, this is the exact pattern that you find. There's an extremely strong correlation between population size and genome size, so much so that you can really remarkably predict the effective population size of organisms, given just how many like transposable elements they have segregating in their genome. So to me, I find that like a very compelling, if we think about that as evidence, right, as that trend, that pattern, providing evidence for the hypothesis that evolution provides to explain this difference. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I am wondering, like, is that something that would show evidence for evolution over creation? And if so, how?
Well, I mean, that's something you would have to tell me. Like if you make a hypothesis for creation, you have to tell me what that entails and what creation is. Like, what is that as a hypothesis? What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, and of course, it's not always easy to pin down what we would expect. I'm just trying to figure out, is there like something that makes that in particular important for demonstrating evolution? Like it to me at the outset, it doesn't really feel like something that I would put on the scale and say that weighs more toward evolution than toward creation. But I mean,
no,
I understand you're making a good point that I would need to set up a parameter for creation. But yeah. I mean, I'm more just contrasting it with like, what would it look like if, evolution weren't true? Like, how would things be different?
How would like the correlations be different?
Yeah, like what I mean is, how is this evidence that everything evolved from a common ancestor?
Yeah. So I think what we need to do then is maybe establish what kind of thing you're looking for, right? So like when evolution is a really big field that covers lots of things, and it's interested in the explaining patterns that we see in biology, right? And so the idea here is that if the forces of evolution are capable of explaining broad patterns in biology, which include things like the vast differences in genome size, like the mechanisms of evolution, if it can explain patterns like vast differences in genome size, that's an incredibly strong hypothesis, right? Now, if you're telling me that creation has no ability to discern that, then it seems like we have like a very stark difference between like a theoretical structure that is capable of approaching problems in biology and providing explanations, and one in which the hypothesis is unclear even what the prediction would be and how it would even try to address that question.
Right. Okay, but can we just try not contrasting it with creation, but contrasting it with just the idea that, like, so anything else but evolution? Like, so how is this supplying evidence for evolution? And when I'm saying evolution, I'm not talking about definitions that people tend to use, like changes in allele frequencies over time or something like that, because of course I agree with that definition. The definition of evolution that I am countering is the idea that the diversity of life emerged from a common ancestor by natural processes. Yeah, so how does this idea, because the correlation between population size and size of genome, I'm not seeing a reason that would lean more toward evolution from a common ancestor. But I'm asking, is there something about it that is showing that?
Yeah, no. So the original question was how can I use predictive power to make, like what sort of predictive power does evolution have? It wasn't, and I read that as just a question about, can I make predictions about nature with evolutionary theory? And that's, I think, what I provided. Okay. Now you're asking what I think is a different question, right? Which is, can you give evidence for universal common descent, right? And those to me are two different questions, because evolution, again, is a really big thing that includes universal common descent, but it also includes literally like natural selection, right? Like changes in allele frequencies is also evolution. All of those things are encompassed within a very big umbrella. So if we want to know about like evidence for universal common descent, then that's a little bit of a different conversation.
And you're right. We were just talking about the predictive power. So what is the principle of evolution that you use to make that prediction? Like, what is it about evolution that made you make that prediction?
Great question. So evolution is a process-based science, and this distinguishes it from an organismal-based science, in which very often when we think about describing things in nature, we're thinking about approaching organisms, molecules, and just like descriptions of how they work, right? Evolution is really powerful because it's based on process. So it's based on how does natural selection, genetic drift, mutation, and gene flow, which are processes, how do they interact with one another? And then how can we use models, which are mathematical based, how can we use these mathematical models to then make predictions about nature, right? So we take these process-based science and try to understand something about nature. And so when we look at these models, what they tell us is that what constrains the efficiency of selection, what selection tries to do is drive efficiency, right? And a lot of people get this wrong. Selection is not trying to make complex organisms. It's actually not what it's trying to do. It only cares about reproductive efficiency. That's all it sees, right? It's trying to get rid of anything that gets in the way of reproductive efficiency and promote anything that helps reproductive efficiency. That's selection. But selection is just one of four processes, and the other three get in selection's way. And they provide different directions for evolution to take. Genetic drift is that random walk of exploring state space, right? Mutation is what allows these new states to exist in the first place. And then gene flow spreads those state space around dispersed populations. And so when you think about evolution as this holistic thing that includes all of these processes, you understand that you learn that the dynamics that it can actually produce are wildly different depending on which one of these levers you crank. Right. And so why we make this particular prediction is that, okay, we crank down natural selection in populations where genetic drift is cranked up. Right. And so genetic drift is cranked up and mutation is allowed to just put a bunch of junk into the DNA that selection can't get rid of. Then we expect those populations should have a lot more junk. Right. You crank up selection and down drift over here, then you expect those populations should have a lot less junk. And that's how the process-based view of evolution allows us to make these big predictions about scales across biology. Does that answer your question? I hope I wasn't too verbose.
Yes, it does. And actually, I think it hits on something that we probably share in common, because like when you're talking about gene flow and genetic drift and variation, like natural variations that come with recombination and stuff like that, I think we're on the same page, right? Like, so like I was looking at some of the stuff that you were doing on your channel, and actually some of those are like the videos that when I Googled, okay, what is gene flow? Your video came up. And so, and like, I liked your explanations of those, and I don't have a conceptual problem with that. So I feel like that's something that like is not an area of contention. I think the like area of contention is maybe what mutations are capable of.
Okay.
Right? Because do you also see things like recombination being capable of carrying an organism to like get a new organ or a new system?
Yeah, I think the evidence is pretty strong that that's the process, that the combination of mutation and then recombination doesn't generate new things outside of the fact that recombination can be mutagenic. Recombination is the process that underlies like gene conversion. So in that sense, it can be mutagenic. But it's mutation that's the creative force of evolution.
Right. And I think that's where like we're going to diverge in our thinking about what mutation is capable of. So, so what are the things that cause you to believe that mutation is capable of creating things like organs and, like new features within organisms that weren't there before?
Yeah, so there's kind of two components to this. There's the one component in which mutation is the only process that we've observed that's capable of generating change in heritable material that persists for a long time. Like there's others, like epigenetics is a thing that happens, the environment can change it in development, like those things change, but they don't persist for long enough that like evolution needs the time, and those things don't give you enough time, right? So it's a mutation specifically to the heritable material, to DNA that we really care about, right? And that's the only process we've ever seen that's been able to do that. And so if we accept the fact that all living things share a single unit of inheritance or single material of inheritance, right, which is DNA, which is a remarkable observation, and then the patterns of that shared variation nest them quite amazingly onto onto the taxonomy and the way that we understand in like a sort of hierarchical pattern. Understanding how mutations have done that is basically a follow-up. We're now just saying, okay, how did mutation pull that off? Because that pattern already exists. So that's the one thing, is that long before we knew anything about the biology of mutations, we accepted universal common descent based on this shared unit of inheritance, right? So that's the one thing. The second thing is we actually have seen mutation do some pretty incredible things, right? One of my favorite examples of this is, and luckily for me, amphipods are sort of model systems. And in particular, parahyle is one of the key model systems in development. And we've mapped out all their developmental genes. So these are like the Hox genes and all the regulatory networks involved in those genes. Amphipods are really cool. And the name actually means different facing legs, amphipod in different directions. So they have front facing legs, and then they have legs that actually face backwards. So they're kind of like this. They're really kooky guys. Isopods, alternatively, don't have that. All their legs are facing in a single direction, hence isopod, in one direction. And it turns out that with just a tiny turn of a single little knob that's involved in development, a little bit of a change in the regulatory pattern in amphipods, and you can generate the body plan of an isopod in an amphipod. Now, that may not sound that big to you, but these guys are remarkably diverged from each other, like way more diverged than humans and like monkeys. Like they're really, really diverged from each other. And yet within their DNA, very little bit of change, you can completely change their body plans. Now, I'm not saying that that's the exact change that took their ancestors to an amphipod body plan. My point is simply that mutation has a lot of creative power to generate big new features.
Okay, well, can you give an example of something that, because when I think about what would be required, when I know that like most of our organs and systems require many genes, and throughout the animal kingdom, require many different genes working together. And then how would mutations basically come together, like essentially coordinate to be able to build like a lung or a heart or something like that? And would it be able to do it in a timely manner to where it would actually benefit the organism and not drag the organism down for millions of years while the rest of the stuff was being built?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. It's a great question. So how do we integrate systems? Because we are highly integrated systems. How did that happen, right? Well, the fact of the matter is that systems integrate gradually. They don't all integrate all at once. And if we think about what the like common ancestor of all bilateral organisms, right? So organisms that have a front and a back, right? That's effectively a worm, right? And it's a single tube that's just like one little digestive tube with a mouth and an anus, and that's the worm, right? And then from that simple body plan, you make slight little elaborations on it. And through time, those elaborations get more and more complex. So if you look at like annelids, like earthworms, right? Earthworms don't have hearts, but they have this sort of muscular system that is capable of just squeezing a little bit. That just moves the fluids throughout the body. It's not a heart, right? But it is a little vesicle that will squeeze. And then as you get successively more complex organisms, you start to find that these vessels will concentrate into a muscular structure. And this muscular structure becomes what we call the heart. So squid have things that are very similar to this. It's not quite a heart. It's kind of like a 3-chambered device that they have, but it's not completely connected and integrated like the mammal heart. Lungs are kind of similar to this, right? And that you can get a lung basically by starting with just diffusion across a body wall. You just need to get you need to get oxygen to the fluids to get passed around. This is long before even blood, right? So, but you need to have that diffusion process. But you can make that diffusion process even better if you just kind of pinch that body wall a little bit, and you start forming just a little sac, and you make that sac sort of form in on itself, and you increase effectively the surface area, and that increases your ability to do diffusion. And that's really all lungs are, right? They're just highly condensed tissues that increases the surface area and allows a lot of diffusion. And we see this gradation in the complexity of lungs across living things, from very simple living things, again, like flatworms, like nematodes, those sorts of things, all the way to a lot more complex organisms like ourselves. So how does mutations actually do this? Well, they don't do it they're not driven in any direction, right? Mutations are just occurring, and selection is sifting through what is increasing survival probability. So if you have a slight, diverticulum into a little piece of tissue that's increasing surface area, that gets favored, right? And then that starts the process where mutation can begin to direct evolution into what would eventually become a lung. The question of how things get integrated is a little bit like, and more like networks, like gene network kind of thing, is a little bit different of a question than the integration of organ systems. But I've been talking for a while, so I'll let you.
No, this is awesome. Yeah, I mean, go for it. Explain the integration of the genes and working together.
So gene networks are really cool, and I think the evolution of gene networks is one of the most exciting things going on right now. We haven't known, we've known a lot about how genes are integrated for a very long time, but we haven't known the mechanisms of integration for a really long time, really not starting until like the 80s and 90s. And it's really found its way into quant gen, which is what I do. And so it's really exciting, and it's a really cool field. The main thing to think about are how genes start forming these like big, complex integrated systems, and one might even say irreducibly complex systems. How do they form those systems? Well, imagine you start off with a single gene that has one function. Right? That's one gene, one function, and then this gene gets duplicated. And now you've got two genes that do the same function, right? And that's kind of nonsensical. And so most of the time when that happens, this extra gene just dies, right? If drift doesn't get rid of it, and then you just lose that individual that had that duplicate entirely, if it happens to persist and fix in the population, it just dies, it becomes a pseudogene. About 5% of our DNA is composed of these kinds of dead genes that are just the results of duplicates. But some duplicates persist. For example, you and I can differ in the number of ribosomal genes we have by up to 500. So the range in humans is like 100 to 500 ribosomal genes, and we all have different numbers. It's really wild. And it's because they duplicate all the freaking time. They're crazy. So you have lots of variation of ribosomal genes. But when that happens, there's another thing that can happen, and this is what generates gene networks, is since you free both of these copies up to mutate, what can happen is you can have a loss of function on this one and a loss of function on this one that are in different places, and they compensate for each other. Now you have this single function produced by two genes that have to both produce a product. Right? They are both now necessary to generate a product, and you've created an interaction between two genes to make one product. Now, successive duplications can expand on this. And as you expand on this, and this is, we got gene families and things like that, you're expanding on the necessary interactions between genes. You also are allowing these genes to begin to take on new functions as well. And they take on new functions within these networks, and they rewire them. And so you end up with this very large system of multiple gene duplicates that are very similar to each other. And you can actually create phylogenies of many of these regulatory genes that clearly show that they're related to each other, where they have taken on brand new functions. But they have taken on new functions in a way that now, looking in retrospectively, if you took any one of them away, the whole system would collapse. And so the question becomes, well, how did this system possibly emerge? Well, it emerged one little gene duplicate at a time. And in fact, most of the mutations that happened to those duplicates were breaking them. They were breaking them and causing them to need to rely on other duplicates to keep going. And that generates a big complex network. Once you have that big complex network, selection can start tinkering with it, right? And so you get mutations that alter pathways in that network, and selection can build on that process. So that's in a nutshell, as sort of straightforwardly and simplistically as possible, the evolution of like bigger, more complex networks.
Okay, so I'm curious about this because I haven't looked much into, like, do we know the causes of gene duplication? Because I know that sometimes I have read about like some instances where, like, for the Linsky experiment, for example, E. coli, that the way it started being able to metabolize citrate was through a gene duplication and then an alteration, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yes.
I don't know. I may be getting that wrong, but there's certain times when, like, it almost seems like gene duplication is something intentional done by the gene regulatory network. So do you think duplication is mostly intentional, mostly accidental? Is there any, like, studies that have been done on that?
Yeah. I don't know of any molecular mechanism that I would apply an intention to. I'm pretty spooked by words like intention when it comes to molecules. I don't think they have foresight, and goals and things like that. So I don't like to use words like intention to mutational processes. And
let me just tell you that go back and watch all of the intentional words you used when you described all these processes, because it sounded quite intentional a lot of times when you were describing stuff. But I do understand, yes, you want to make this natural processes without intention. So I mean it in the sense of intention as, in the evolutionary way. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that it's fine to use, like, as you said, I also use that language. It's just the way we communicate. So I get it. But I wanted to make sure that that's how you meant it, and you didn't mean it and like the cell knows to make a duplicate kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm embracing your view for the moment, but of course I do think there's intention and purpose and that kind of thing in what's going on. But for the sake of the conversation, I am embracing, like, how you would see the process here.
Yeah. So I see the process as accidental, really and truly. And there's lots of kinds of mechanisms that cause duplications to occur. And it can be something as simple as polymerase slippage. So as you're replicating the DNA, it can just slip and add a few bases. So that's a tiny little sort of duplicate. You can also have really big duplications where you have like non-homologous injoining. That whenever during meiosis, when they're pairing up, you can have the wrong things pair together, and that effectively just like duplicates the region on the other chromosome. So you can have that kind of larger scale. When you get whole genes duplicated, it's almost always that. It's very rare that you get just an entire gene that duplicates and it just happens to include the whole gene and it's polymerase slippage. That doesn't happen, right? It's usually non-homologous injoining that does it. But none of these processes are purposeful or really have like any kind of goal in mind. They happen, just by chance, just by random chance.
Okay, so when, like, it happens and it actually benefits the organism in some way, like immediately, I'm not talking about millions of years later. I mean, when the process of duplication, if it benefits the organism immediately, do you think that's just a chance? Like there's nothing like in the gene regulatory networks that somehow knows, like Dennis Noble would say, and I did watch your video on that, like where like there's something that knows that what is needed and then a gene duplication occurs.
Yeah. No, I don't know of any process that's capable of doing that. So Dennis Noble likes the immune system example. But even in the example of the immune system, the sort of heightened mutation rate is effectively what it's doing, right? In the major histoincompatibility complex, it's effectively just like increasing the mutation rate in this one little protein region so that protein region can possibly fit the antibody, right? And that's really all it's doing. But it's doing it randomly. And most of the times when it makes one, it doesn't make the right one, right? The vast majority of them that they make are dead and they don't actually benefit you, don't benefit your immune response. It's just you do it so many times that eventually you land on one that can fight off a virus or a bacteria or whatever it is you're infected with, right? So you can try to put intentional language into that if you want, but really that whole process is controlled by the DNA. The DNA is actually it's generating the protein that's going to go and make the cuts, right? And then it's also making the repair enzyme that's going to go and not repair everything perfectly because it's just a molecule, it's not perfect, right? So everything is controlled at that level actually by the DNA. So I don't, unless you're going to give DNA purpose and intentionality, I don't, and it's a nucleic acid. That's, to me, that's hard. That's a hard sell to give a nucleic acid intentionality, you know? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely strange. I mean, whatever is true, it's definitely, it's all inspiring that these processes are happening in every cell in our bodies. So
I agree. I think biology is awe-inspiring, and I think it's really, really cool. That's why I do it for a living, because I find it really fascinating. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so what do you think now, when you're talking to someone like me, do you think there's any hope of like me being able to embrace evolution? Or like, what are you coming into this conversation with? Do you think I'm very closed-minded and there's no way I will ever embrace it no matter what the evidence? Or do you think that there's, if there's evidence, could you supply me with the evidence that would convince me that it's true?
Yeah. No, I don't. And I don't mean this to say that I think you're closed-minded. I mean this in that I don't think that there's any like specific piece of evidence that's going to change your mind. Like, I'm not going to like bring you like, look at this fossil and that's going to change your mind, or like, look at this phylogenetic tree and that's going to it's not going to be what changes your mind. It wasn't what changed my mind when I was a creationist. That's not what convinced me. To me, I think the disconnect that we have, and the disconnect I think that everyone has when we're talking, when this conversation is happening, is that we're coming at it from two very, very, very different foundations. And it's a foundational thing that we can talk all the science we want, but I don't actually think you're approaching this through the lens of science. And you said it at the very beginning, right? Like that you have a religious bias and that's where you're coming from. And so I can't actually convince you with science when it wasn't science that convinced you, right? Like we're not talking the same language.
Well, now this is where I do think, so I'm admitting my extreme bias, right? But I am still trying to approach it scientifically. So even though I'm extremely biased, I still would say that I am approaching whether or not evolution is true based on our scientific observations. And so even if I did not have my religious beliefs, I wouldn't at this point accept evolution because on the basis of our scientific observations. So are you also, because I think you are also coming at it with a religious bias, and that is a religious bias toward natural processes. Would you say that that's true?
I don't call science a religion. I think that cheapens the concept of religion to call science a religion. Science is a philosophical position, to be sure, and it's a philosophical position that is completely bound to methodological naturalism. It has to be. It has a series of axioms that must be accepted at the beginning to be able to do science, right? And so I'm accepting those axioms of science to have to approach the world in a natural way, or to understand the world in a natural way. And I justify that because science has been extremely successful, right? Like the ability for us to have this conversation, the fact that many of us are even still alive, right, is thanks to advances in science. So I think science has proven itself to be a very competent way of investigating the natural world. And so because of that, I don't think that's a religious position. I think that's sort of an objective thing that we can look at the world and see, like, yes, accepting these presuppositions, following the scientific method actually seems to generate good results.
Right. But that's the thing is, I think that's something that we agree on. So I guess maybe I'm not agreeing with your definition of science because would you say that this is an accurate like that science is an accurate description of what science is. It's trying to discover the truth about reality, like with empirical observations.
That's close, but there's lots of things that promote themselves as discovering truth about reality, right? Like religion also aspires to give truth about reality,
right? But with empirical observations.
Yeah, but what is an empirical observation? I look at it, right? Like if I'm looking at my wall right now, am I doing science? That's an empirical observation. Science is much more than that, right? So science is a much deeper process that requires lots more steps and lots more investigation than merely observation. And science is also not just about collecting facts. Facts are actually like the most boring part of science. Science is about constructing theoretical frameworks that explain reality and explain the natural world and make predictions about the natural world based on the laws and processes of the natural world, right? That's fundamentally what science is and why science works.
Right. And so what part of that do you think I am not accepting?
I think so you mentioned creation earlier, right?
Right.
Presumably that implies a creator.
Right.
And I assume that implies something that is outside of the natural world, is a force that is not natural and therefore not capable of being investigated and capable of inquiring about its nature and about its creative ability and why it created the way that it did. All of those things are unknowable to us mere mortals, right?
Right. But that's not what I'm using. So, like, if I'm trying to figure out something about reality, like, does this medication work? I'm not appealing to something outside. I'm looking and doing the same processes that you discussed. So I think we're on the same ground at that point.
No, I think you're selectively applying science, right? You're applying science to questions like, does medicine work? Or, like how does gravity work? I assume you would accept the basic like general relativity explanation for gravity. But when it comes to the origin and diversity of life, you're not applying the scientific method to that question. That question, you're saying there's an extra thing that I'm going to put on top of that is fundamentally not within the realms of science.
Well, see, I'm wondering if that's what I'm doing, or if what's happening is that the methodology that you're using is actually limiting your ability. And so, like, let's just say, like, we went to Mars, okay, and we found, some kind of device on Mars that didn't look anything like what we've created, but it had properties of being machine-like or something like that. Like, it seems to me that, like, if you can't appeal to something outside, like if it seems like you would be limited. So, like, let's say I said, hey, that looks like it was designed. I don't know what it is. I don't know who made it, but it looks like it was designed. And you were like, no, there's nobody here. It can't be designed. Like, we have to find how this came about by natural processes. It seems like you would be limiting what you could discover about what we found.
I mean, you're limited to natural explanations in science. Do we agree that natural explanations must be used in science? If you invoke supernatural things, you are ceasing to do science.
I don't think, well, okay, it depends on in what sense you mean that, because there are some senses where, like, okay, let's say something happens, and you say that lightning bolt happened because of a natural process, and I said God made that lightning bolt happen. Okay, that would be not using science. Okay, but let's say we see. Right, like that would be me not using science.
No, I'm trying to see how this is different than the way you're applying this to evolution. It seems like exactly the same thing to me.
Does it?
It does, but I'm going to let you finish your analogy.
Okay, well, I think the way it's different is that when I'm looking at life and I look at, these complex integrated systems, right? In order to figure out where do complicated integrated systems come from, how can I see, like, what are the observations I can make about reality that would show me how something like that could come about? Is
Mhm.
it something, are there natural processes that show me how that could come together? Or, what are the processes that cause something, as fantastic as a bird or, any flower or, these efficient systems in life? Like, what do we see that make those come about? And what we see in our observations is that intelligent beings make things, right? Like, we make complex integrated systems. So my observation of reality is that intelligence is involved in that. So that makes me say, if I'm really being scientific about how I'm thinking, if there's no natural process that can account for a feature in life, then it's very scientific to think that there is some kind of intelligent being involved in that.
Okay, so there's a lot of things there. So one is the like we don't prove things or we don't demonstrate things in science by saying I didn't see this, therefore it is this, right? You can falsify a hypothesis, but by falsifying a hypothesis, you're not demonstrating a different one, right? You still have to demonstrate that one, and that one has to be testable using the means of science. If it happens to be that birds were created by a deity, that would be outside of the realms of science. It just fundamentally would be. It would be something we couldn't investigate with the tools of science. But you said something else that's a little bit more curious to me, and that is that I feel like I've spent a lot of time explaining how complex systems can emerge in natural processes, and lots of us do a ton of work demonstrating that complex things can emerge from natural processes. And you make the leap that they can't emerge from natural processes. And furthermore, we know that like the thing that connects all living things have one material of inheritance, right? It's DNA. All living things have this, and all living things get their DNA from their parents. And we know that there are changes to the DNA that can change the form of organisms, right? So, and we know the rules and the laws that those things follow. And so using the principles of science, then that would suggest universal common descent by the simple fact that all of those things have the same heritable material. Those laws, as far as we can tell, have always worked in exactly the same way. And the laws that change populations, mutation, selection, drift, and gene flow, have always worked in exactly the same way. What you seem to be doing is saying at some point in the past, those things stopped working or don't work anymore or are incapable of working in the way that they work today in the present. And I don't understand why that leap is being made or has to be made.
Well, I think actually I'm saying that we see certain ways that changes happen within organisms. Like, I think we're in complete agreement that there's genetic variation that happens, there's recombination, there's gene flow, genetic drift, and these can make small changes in organisms. But what I don't see is large scale changes being made. So, and throughout the fossil record, even we see that, right? Like,
I'm sorry, I explained to you earlier about the changes and the development. You could completely generate an entirely new body plan by barely changing regulation. I don't understand how that's not a big change. Like that's literally an order level change. Like amphipods and isopods are in different orders, and you can generate the difference in the order of an organism by tweaking its development, right? Just a few mutations. And that to me that's a big change, no?
Yeah, I would say that's a good one. That's a big change. And it's very interesting that can happen with just one, change, one mutation. So I would say you gave a good example, but I don't know if that's the kind of like, so it's still a leg, right? It's going in the opposite direction. But where do we get the legs? Where do we get the wings? Where do we get the lungs and the hearts and the brains and all of these things? So that's what I'm not really seeing. So a change in a direction of a leg, yes, it's a big change, but where do we get the legs?
So what I suspect is happening, and this is why I don't find this "give me your best evidence" thing ever useful. It's because I can give evidence, and you'll say, okay, but then what about? Right? It's this like what about ism. So there's always going to be the next thing. Now explain this. Now explain this. Now explain this. And if biology can't explain every little single thing, which assumes that we know every single thing, and we don't know every single thing, that if we can't explain every single little detail, oh, there's a gap there, evolution must not be true. And that's not a genuine way to do science. Not when we already have processes that are capable of causing change. And we've seen pretty big changes, as you've just admitted, they're capable of doing. We've seen selection work. We've seen adaptation happen. So we have a mechanism that fits organisms into their environment. We know that species can split and new species can form. I think most creationists accept reproductive isolation can evolve. And we've seen, and we know how inheritance works. And we see all living things have the same mode of inheritance, the same material of inheritance. Those things, to me, that's a closed, like that is enough to solidify universal common descent. To deny universal common descent would be to deny one of those things. One of those pillars have to be false for universal common descent to be false. Or you invoke a last Thursdayism where we stop at some point in the past and God takes over, right? And at some like arbitrary line in the past.
Okay. Well, so do you think what types of things could show like that, for example, shared DNA, like if shared DNA is evidence for common ancestry, so like there's lots of issues with the tree, right? So like, is there anything that could show you that the tree is not true, the common ancestry tree?
The common ancestry tree is not true. Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's actually quite easy to falsify it. And I think there's a really great example of this in that, one, it would be quite confusing if it turned out that gorillas were more closely related to roses than they were to chimps and humans. That would be surprising, right? That would probably fundamentally undermine DNA as like some kind of common material, right? That would be confusing to us, right? And we have actual examples of this kind of thing. Like viruses is a really great example of this. Viruses as a thing aren't really a thing. Like the concept of a virus emerged multiple times independently, right? There's not just like a single origin to viruses. Viruses are spread out and come from all kinds of different things. And so we actually know what it would look like if there were sort of independent origin events and the shared patterns of DNA didn't actually reflect ancestry because we have viruses, right? But when you look at the tree of life of all things that we count as living, they don't look like viruses, right? Like that's not what the tree looks like. The tree actually turns out to look just like you would expect under universal common descent.
Okay. Well, I guess that for me, one of the things that is really big evidence against evolution is that the tree doesn't make sense. Like there's different proteins in different organisms. There's different, the morphology when like doesn't match up with the genetics. You've got even in the phylogenetic trees when the things are supposed to be closely related, then you have like multiple independent origins of features. And so like it doesn't really come together as a tree. So I don't really see how.
Can you give me some examples of that? I don't know if I agree with any of that, and so but I want to know some examples. So to
Okay.
if you don't have any on top of your head, that's fine.
No, I do. I have lots on the top of my head.
Okay, go ahead.
For example, I read this paper recently about the evolution of Coalescent. Okay. And so ticks, spiders, what are the other two? Scorpions and something else, mites. Okay. So apparently, like within that group, the Coalescent, they say venom evolved separately 4 times, like completely independently. Okay. So to me, that's odd, right? Like you've got organisms that are even similar, but they're not even working. Like they had to evolve these things independently. It already seems strange that, and also within that group of Coalescent, they evolved the ability to spin silk 3 times independently. Now that's really weird, right? Like if this is a tree and all of these organisms evolved in the same way, why do we have to do silk more than once? It already seems highly improbable to get like this spinneret, this complex machinery that like would be a wonder, to us, just if we had something like this, right? And then it has to evolve independently 3 times. So how does that work?
Yeah. So I mean, is there anything in evolutionary theory that says you can't evolve like the same, like similar structures multiple times? And I suspect that these are not identical structures, right? Like it's not like it's evolving the exact same kind of structure, like spinnerets and the way they're using silk is different in each of these. The venom is not identical. I assume it's different in each of these. And probably the molecular pathway in which the venom is being produced is probably slightly different in each of these. I doubt it's the exact same genes that are producing the exact same venom, right? You read the paper, I did.
Yeah, and so yes, and but like that's the thing is like, do you not think that it would be improbable to even get 1 time? Like, would you say it's an improbable event to get a spinneret?
Okay, so that's a great question. So that is a question about what's the shape? Are you familiar with like concepts of like fitness landscapes?
Yes, from listening to you. Yes.
Okay. So sorry, I'm gonna do a fitness landscape thing.
Yeah, explain it.
It's a really useful idea in thinking about this, and in particular because we've got a lot of empirical fitness landscapes for proteins now. There's a lot of really great studies on this, and so basically what it is if you can imagine sort of a topographic map where any step in that map is a trait, right? A unique combination of a protein, a sequence space, trait space, whatever it might be. And there are peaks where these areas have high fitness, and then there are valleys of really low fitness, right? And so the probability of you climbing any given peak is a function of how smooth that shape is, right? So it turns out that some peaks are very easy to climb. There's lots of proteins in which there are hundreds of thousands of different conformations that'll get you to that exact same protein. Andreas Wagner is the guy that has done a ton of work on looking at empirical fitness landscapes for proteins. And most fitness landscapes turn out to be very rugged. But what that means is that there's lots of little hills. And so you can walk through sequence space and find the exact same solution to problems from many different angles. And what that implies is that it's actually a lot easier to evolve these structures than we think it is. Eugene Koonin had a paper out just this year, just like last month, where they basically evolved tons of different protein structures and showed that you could generate many of the proteins that we see in nature. You could generate them by just randomly changing conformations. And so it seems intuitive to us that it must be hard. There must only be one way to get a good spinneret, right? But actually, it seems like there's many ways to get a good spinneret. And nature has shown us that. And then when we do it in the lab, we find it in the lab that there's many ways to get a good protein that will do the thing that you need it to do. And if you really think about biodiversity, it makes sense. Like the reason there is so much biodiversity is because there's so many different ways of making a living, right? What that implies is there's many different ways to build proteins to make a living. Whether you're a spider, you have those sorts of proteins, and that helps you make a living. If you're a monkey, you have those proteins that help you make a living. They're all different from each other, and they all happen to work, right? So if universal common descent is true, that implies that there was a lot of space for those original proteins to further explore. And it turns out there's millions of ways to do it, as evidenced by the millions of species that live on the planet today and the billions that have gone extinct through time. I hope that makes sense.
Well, it sounds more like a hopeful belief that these things could happen. So I
gave you empirical evidence, though. I talked you through laboratory experiments of proteins evolving the same thing multiple times. That's not belief. That is literally empirical evidence.
Cornelius, where are you when I need you? Look, there's a guy who has a channel called Darwin's God, okay, and he just did a refutation of that Kuhnen paper that came out showing why this is just that it was not a good experiment for the proteins. But I actually don't remember the details of it, so I can't. That's why I said, "Where are you when I need you?" But anyway,
I'm happy to explain the details of that paper. And
yeah,
you can
let's do it.
What you think is wrong?
Yeah, do it. Yeah, please refresh my memory.
What's really cool about this paper? It's called an in silico experiment, which basically means it's in a computer, right? That's what in silico in this sense means. But we know organic chemistry, right? Like we can sit down and make predictions about how chemicals should react with each other based on conformations and based on like valence electron configurations, right? So if you know the valence electron configurations, you know the atoms that are involved with it, it's basic organic chemistry, how these things should behave, right? I assume everybody accepts that. Well, it turns out you can take that, code it into a computer, and you can generate like simulated molecules that follow all of the rules of organic chemistry. All you have to know is the rules of organic chemistry, right? You know those rules, you build the molecule in the computer that follows those rules, and then you just randomly change it. And then you see if the conformations that you see in nature form. It turns out they do, and they will many, many times. Like, to me, I don't, unless you're arguing against the rules of organic chemistry, or you're arguing that there's some flaw in the software, which I don't know Cornelius, maybe he's a software engineer, but like, as far as I know, it's a pretty standard software for looking at organic chemistry. So,
now this could get into a very big conversation because, from my understanding, is that this is not something that's easy to do, not even maybe even impossible to do by natural processes, right? To get amino acids to form together into a protein. So everything you talked about is us manipulating things, right? Like intelligent beings manipulating things, right? Like from what we already know about how the systems work. No?
Intelligent beings are not manipulating anything. The intelligent beings have done nothing here. All the intelligent beings did was build the software that follows the rules of organic chemistry, right? And then you just say randomly mutate, and that's it, right? Like the intelligent beings are not like moving the thing around and make it's like you're just letting it follow the rules of organic chemistry. So and amino acids will absolutely form together in nature. We have tons of examples. In fact, some of them are really dangerous. They're called prions, right? And a prion is just like a rogue protein that will replicate itself, and that like it's the cause of like mad cow disease, right? And it's just a natural protein that infects things. So like amino acids will absolutely form on their own, and they will absolutely form polypeptides on their own. Again, this is just like.
But will they form homochirally on their own?
Well, in certain mixtures, right? Like I mean, again, it's like what's the stable state? And when you're talking about things like in life, we are now producing protein. So it's no longer just happening like out in a pond. Like we are making it certain ways. Right. So it would make sense that we would make it a particular way. That's just how we started making it. And that happens to be how it's now made, which to me is more evidence for universal common descent, in exactly the same way that shared DNA is evidence for universal common descent.
Wait, how is that evidence for universal common descent?
Do we all do it the same way? All of the basic cellular processes are done the same way across all life. That implies, just like shared inheritance mechanisms, right, that there's a universal common descent. Where did you get the ability to do that cellular process from? Your parents, who got it from their parents, it's the exact same kind of argument, right? So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but I mean, look, in the tip of my finger is machines more fantastic than anything humans have ever made and more numerous. So why am I going to talk about things that are happening within a cell and think that those processes, those machines, and I really hate the word protein because it does not capture what these things are. So these are machines that are doing very complex processes and they're all working together in harmony. So how does something like that form out of chemicals?
The entire way in which you worded that is not right. They are proteins. They are molecules. They follow the basic rules of organic chemistry. And it's very important that we understand that they are molecules. They are made of atoms that are found in nature. There's nothing special about them outside of that. They do incredible things and that they build organisms, and I think organisms are incredible. But just because organisms are incredible doesn't mean they're not natural. A mountain is an incredibly beautiful thing, but it's a completely natural thing, right? Like you can look at the surface of Mars and it's really pretty, but it's also a natural thing. We're not cheapening cells. We're not cheapening life by saying that it emerged by natural processes. Furthermore, to call them machines, I think, is to fundamentally misunderstand the way that they function. These things are like, there's nothing about them that resembles machines in the way that humans build machines. We analogize them to machines in the same way that we like use intentional language when we talk about these things. It's just easy when the medium in which we exchange ideas is language. So then we use that medium in the best way we can help us understand complex ideas, because organic chemistry is complicated, right? But it's not magic, right? It's not divine. It's just physics writ large. That's really all it is. And I don't mean that in like a derogatory way. I mean that in a cool way.
Yeah, but I mean, is it really physics? Like, because from what I understand about the origin of life, and I know that's getting like probably to the topic that you don't like deal with, but you know, the books I've read, even by secular people who are investigating origin of life, they admit that the pathways that we would need for chemistry to become life, what we actually need is new physics. Like they say it actually, every conceivable pathway violates what we know about physics and the way that chemistry works. So it seems strange to me to hear you say it's just chemistry, because it's not, though. It's like a lot more than that, and it doesn't.
I will say that I don't. Again, it's not. I'm not a chemist. I'm not like this. It's not my field. Origin of life. I have read some books on the origin of life. So I've read some of these chemists and some of the things that they say. I've never heard them say that we need new chemistry. They will say that we don't know. They will provide hypotheses that are hypotheses. They have to be tested, and and it's a thing we're still trying to figure out. But like, what we have done now is we're shifting the goalpost away from what's the obvious thing, and that's that we already have a very clear pattern of universal common descent. Even if God put the very first cell onto the earth, universal common descent is still true. And it's still true because of a shared basis of inheritance. And unless we're going to say that the rules of inheritance and the rules of evolutionary change, the processes that we agree on, unless those things changed arbitrarily at some point in the past, universal common descent is true. That's what we have to deal with.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, so like what you have supplied doesn't really tell me that universal common ancestry is true. So like you've said, like the fact that we all use the same basis, like the DNA is the same, like we all use the same system. So for someone, I can see how for someone who only believes natural processes can be involved, that would, lead you to believing in a common ancestor rather than separate ancestry by, natural processes. But for someone who believes that God created, right? So,
but you see, we're invoking things that are outside of the realm of science. We're changing the foundation of the conversation right now. And that's what I meant earlier, is that we have, like, to reject universal common descent requires you to change the foundation of the rules of the conversation we're having. It requires that you invoke something I can't invoke. I can't invoke a supreme deity, because then I cease to be doing science.
Now, and that's where I think I think we do have a disagreement there, because how is it if you can't do science while believing and invoking a deity? How did so many of our greatest scientists invoke a deity and still come, have amazing scientific discoveries?
I don't mean you have to be an atheist to do science. That's not what I mean, at all. And in fact, I think, like, I have lots of colleagues that my PhD advisor was like a Catholic, like a staunch Catholic. So like, you don't have to be an atheist to do science. My point, and you can be inspired by your religion, and you can think that God had a hand in all of these things, and all of that can be true. But when we talk about science and when we do science, those things have to be over here, because you can't invoke those things to explain your science. That's the key, right? You can't mix those ideas, because once you start mixing those ideas, you've now ceased to do science. Because if you can invoke a deity at any point, I can invoke a deity at any point. Any observation I make, I can just invoke a deity for, and then science ceases to be objective, right? It ceases to be something that we can actually distinguish between, if at any point we can just say God changed the rules.
Right, but I'm not really saying God changed the rules. And
you are saying God changed the rules.
How did he change the rules?
I said that there's three key things for universal common descent to be true. Shared basis of inheritance. The rules of inheritance are the same through all time, and the mechanisms of evolution are the same. So you are saying that one of those things has to be false. The rules of life have to have changed at some point in the past for universal common descent to be false. And what changed those rules was God. That's your argument.
But you set the rules, though. Like, I didn't agree to those
nature
rules.
Set the rules. I didn't set. Those are the things we have observed and discovered in nature that you said you agreed with.
I agree that all of life has DNA at the same system, right? Like, I agree with that.
Okay, then let's start there. Then what is DNA? What is it?
What is it? It is coded information.
But where did you get it? It's the material of inheritance, right? It's passed on from generations. That's the thing that all life passes on, right?
Right. And I have no problem with that either. Right.
And we know it can change. We know that there are processes that change that DNA, and those changes can be passed on to future generations.
Yes.
And we know the rules that they follow, right? We know about Mendelian inheritance. We know about particulate inheritance. We know the rules that it follows. And then we know that natural selection exists, gene flow, genetic drift, and mutation. We know those things exist. We agree on those things.
Yes.
If those things are true, and all life uses DNA as its inheritance mechanism, then you should be able to trace back through time and follow lines of descent. And all you have to do is accept those things as being true, and not say at some point in the past they arbitrarily stopped being true, and you get the tree of life. Now, if you say at some point in the past they stopped being true, you either have to have a really good natural reason to explain that, or you're invoking God. Right? You're invoking something.
And of course I am invoking God for that. But what I'm saying is God can, so I feel like what you're doing is actually limiting your scientific exploration, because you have blocked off one thing and said, no matter what, this cannot be true, right? So you're actually limiting your ability to do science because you have said one conclusion cannot be true. There cannot be, this creative force, this creative being, the creator being. You're saying that can't be true. And so that brings you, that can cause you to have some like really wrong conclusions. And I would say bring you to like ridiculous beliefs, because you're willing to accept natural processes bringing about everything, even in spite of the evidence. Like if evidence shows natural processes cannot, you can't accept any other conclusion.
You have no evidence. You're invoking a deity. There's no evidence for this. Like this, so we're not having an evidentiary discussion anymore. What you're telling me is that I'm not following the rules of science, which I'm telling you, like, as a scientist, I know what the rules of science are, right? And the reason that we don't invoke deities is like, I can explain why a ball falls in two ways. I can explain that a ball falls because of gravity, or I can explain it that there's a fairy that carries it down to earth every time I let it go. How do I falsify that the fairy is the thing that does it? If I specify that fairy is supernatural, you can't see it, you can't taste it, touch it, feel it, nothing like that. How do I falsify that fairy exists? What you're suggesting here is the same thing, that everything that we observe, the rules of inheritance, that evolutionary mechanisms, DNA, all of these things, everything we have observed, including pretty strong creative power of mutation, including changing body plans, which you accepted earlier.
I accepted the change in a leg, the change in a leg.
Now you're rolling it back. All of the things.
No, I'm not rolling it back. I accepted that that's a major change. I'll say that's a major change.
All of those things that you accept presently, you are saying at some point in time, for some reason, and that reason is insert supernatural deity, those things that we have actually observed and can do science on have to stop. Now, to me, that's a science stopper. When you start invoking things that I can't test, that I can't confirm, that there's no way that I can make predictions based off of, you have stopped the scientific process. You have fundamentally endangered it. Because, for example, going all the way back to the very beginning, when I talked about the predictions that I can make using evolution, if what you say is true, then suddenly how can I trust those predictions anymore? Suddenly all of the things that I've been able to explain about the natural world and make accurate predictions about the natural world using become suspect, because now I no longer know whether organisms are going to follow the rules of inheritance going into the future if they didn't follow them going into the past, right? Everything, all of the threads become unwoven if you could change the rules willy-nilly.
Okay, but so we're both saying each other is limiting science, right? Because now I admit that there are some things that the idea of a creator, you won't be able to test, right? And you won't be able to, know certain things. But there are some things that you can, like I'm saying, if you look at reality and like, so, what is the best explanation for this paper? Is this your paper? No, it's not. What is the best explanation for this? Did this come about by natural processes? Is that the best explanation? Or is the better explanation that this was the work of an intelligent being, right? Or multiple intelligent beings. So to me, when I look at this paper, I see this is a work of intelligent beings. And there's no way I'm going to accept this as, a coming about by natural processes of mutation and natural selection. No way. But how much more information is in DNA, compared to this paper? There's massive amounts more information in DNA. So why would I think that information could come about by natural processes? So you're limiting it by saying...
You don't believe, that's not actually what you believe. You don't believe that paper was written by an intelligence because it has so much information. You believe that that paper was written by an intelligence because you've seen humans write papers, and you know that papers are written by humans. This is a thing we can directly observe happen. What you've never directly observed happen is God creating something. You're invoking a force that has no observational evidence for. That paper has observational evidence for. We know humans write things. What we don't know is what God does and what God doesn't do and how God would create if God created, right? Those are things that are a mystery to us and to science, right? And so I am not trying to put characteristics into a deity and tell a deity how it would or wouldn't have done something. I don't know what those characteristics would be. I do know what the characteristics of humans, and I know that humans write papers. I don't know if deities make DNA or not. I've never seen one do that.
Now, you're right that human beings write papers, and I know that. But, it's more about the information. That's the point, is that we know the source of information. The only source of information that we know about is intelligence. So for me to say that information, came about by a natural process, that's something that violates our science. That's something that goes against our scientific observations.
What do we mean? So now we're going to have to do the whole what is information thing. What is information? What do you mean by that?
Is this too exhausting? Exhausting?
No, it's just because it's like a predictable thing. We always
I know.
What is information?
And actually, people have had this conversation over and over again, so we don't even have to go down that path. Like, honestly, I have an evolutionary biologist captive right now. I want to hear more about your experience, because actually I do think, like, seriously, it's a huge, awesome blessing to me to have your time. And Dr. Dan also was willing to come on and do this. And so shout out to Dr. Dan for being willing to do this too. But, for me, as someone who doesn't see what you see, I have the opportunity to see what you see. So I want to be quiet now and let you say more about what you see that I'm not seeing.
What I see that I'm not seeing about the evidence for evolution?
Yes.
Or about...
Yeah. What have we not talked about that you have knowledge of that I don't have knowledge of, because I have not studied in the way that you have?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, I don't know the kinds of things that you're looking for that you would find compelling, right? Because again, I think that we really have gone where I thought it was going to be, and that we just differ on foundationally what science is and what science is capable of doing. And if we differ on that, nothing I tell you will ever be convincing, because we differ on how science works. And that's a philosophical difference. It's not even like an empirical difference. That's a difference in our starting points. You are right. I am limiting science because science has to be limited to function correctly. If any old idea can be thrown in and be called scientific, then we've just destroyed the scientific process. It doesn't work anymore. It's not supposed to explain everything. That's not what it does. It explains the natural world. And it just so happens that organisms are natural beings that exist in the natural world. They're made up of natural things, right? And so that's a question that we can try to answer with science. And the answer that science gives is evolution. That's the answer that science gives. Now, that's not the only kind of knowledge system. Religion is another kind of knowledge system. And if that's the knowledge system you want to go with understanding how the world came about and how living things came about, nothing I'm going to tell you from a scientific perspective is going to change that basis of your knowledge system. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I totally admit that, I have a strong belief in God, and so that is going to color how I see things. And I do see when I look at the natural world, I see things that are very obviously designed.
Well,
so
what?
To me,
what is how do you know something in the natural world is designed not by human, a thing that's not a human design? How do you distinguish between, I don't know, a prion or a virus and something that's alive? How do you know what is a designed thing and what's not a designed thing?
Well, let's, and now that's going to go to another philosophical discussion that I've had
it's really
many times with people saying, if God created everything, then all things are designed. So even rocks are designed. So how can I distinguish between a designed and not designed? Okay. That could also be a really long discussion, right? And it, like you said about the other path I was going down, it's a conversation that follows a predictable trajectory, and I don't know if it. What's that?
Oh, I was saying I agree. It does follow a very predictable trajectory. How about this? Maybe this can be the trajectory, and then maybe this will be like our last 10, 15-minute trajectory.
Okay.
One of the things that I've heard a lot, and I don't really understand, and this is a question for you, because you may not have evolutionary biologists always in captive audience, but I have a creationist in captive audience, and I don't always have that either. So like, this goes both ways. So I'm curious about why it is that creationists make the argument that like shared DNA is evidence for common design. That like these hierarchical patterns in DNA is evidence for common design. Why is that?
Okay, I don't. Are they making the argument that it's evidence for common design, or are they just saying it's a feature? It's like, like that's just what common design. It's just a matter of fact that it's common design.
God just did it this way.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that's what we're saying is like, I'm never going to go to someone and say, look, our shared genes, this is evidence of a common designer. Okay. I'm not going to go to anyone with like saying that is evidence for a common designer.
Interesting. A lot of people do. A lot of creationists.
I'm sorry. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Am I breaking up? I think maybe mine.
Well, yeah, you broke up for a minute, but I got you back. Okay. Well, I think what they're trying to say is they're trying to say, look, you're saying this is common ancestry, but we see this as common design.
Yeah, and my question is why? Why would a common designer do it that way?
Well, and now you're asking me to get in the head of the designer. So I don't know, but I can guess.
That's scientific mechanism, right?
I can guess. So I would guess that one reason is it sure makes it easier for us to do science, right? Like, how would it make sense if we had to figure out everything new from scratch? So one thing is it makes it easier to do science. Second reason is, why should he do it less efficiently? Like, why should he do a less efficient process of, recreating everything from scratch? Do
you think that because that would be hard for him? Is that what you mean? That would be harder to do it that way?
I don't think, we're talking about God. He can do anything, so he could do it anyway. Yeah. But so I'm not going to say harder, but would there be a reason he should?
I don't know. People. So my question is that like common design proponents always say, well, the reason that humans and chimps share a bunch of DNA, or that any two organisms share a bunch of DNA, is because they have a common designer. And I'm just wondering, why in the world would that make any sense? Like a common designer, presumably an omnipotent one, could design things any way they wanted to. There's no actual reason why it would be that way. If I build 3 houses, right, I can build one with wood, one with brick, and one with stone, and I still built 3 different houses with different materials, and I'm the common designer, right? And so I don't understand why that argument is one that's used all the time. It seems like a retrofitting sort of thing. Like you could fit that to anything.
Right. And like I said, I don't think that they're supplying that as evidence. I think they're just saying, look, you can explain shared DNA with common ancestry or common design. So there's no, common ancestry doesn't have, just having shared DNA, that is not evidence for common ancestry when we're talking, if we were common ancestry. Yeah. Of course, as a creationist, there is the line where God created, right? So, yeah, but let me ask you.
But you see how what you're talking about right now you can't see that as a scientific thing that you just said, right? That there's just somewhere that God created and that's the line. Like, what other scientific thing sounds like that? Like, what other scientific hypothesis is even remotely like that, right?
And I understand your concern, and I'll admit that at that point, that is not, any assumption about what happened, like at that point it's a I guess you'd call it a supernatural event or a divine event, and it can't really be tested scientifically, right? But the point I'm trying to make about your processes is that what if, just suppose that really is true, that God created and there's a line, okay? But you have decided that no, there cannot be a line there. There is definitely no line there. And so no matter what, no matter how ridiculous the ideas become, there has to be
sprinkling in your ideology there a little bit.
Well, there has to be a natural process. So isn't that also like limiting?
So let's think about it like this. Could God have created the entire universe and everything in it in exactly the way that it is today, last Thursday? What if we drew the line last Thursday?
He could have.
He could have.
But I think we have good evidence that he didn't.
He wouldn't know. Do you have good evidence? What evidence do you have that God did not create the world last Thursday?
Well, okay, now this is also going into really philosophical territory, because
this is what happens when you add this kind of stuff to science, as it becomes nonsensical.
So, but I'm not adding it to science. I'm asking you, like, what if what I'm saying about reality is true? There is a line, right?
I just told you. It would be the same as if saying God created everything in the world exactly to look like it had age last Thursday. It's exactly the same thing. We would have no way of telling it apart, right? There's no way to falsify that hypothesis. It's not scientific. I can't prove it wrong, right? It's like saying we live in a simulation. I can't prove that wrong, right? That's a thing you can say, but I can't use science to like test it. It doesn't do anything for me. For all intents and purposes, it looks like the world wasn't created last Thursday, right? All the evidence seems to suggest that that's not true. But if the world was created last Thursday, this is what it would look like, right? And so I can't go into science with that kind of presupposition in my brain. I have to trust that what I see is real, and that what we observe is real, and that the laws of nature are the same today, tomorrow, and yesterday, right? And if that is true, if we can accept that there's an objective reality and that the laws of nature are uniform and have been the same through time, that gravity was the same 10,000 years ago and will be the same 10,000 years hence, then we can make statements about the past like universal common descent. It's the natural thing that would emerge from that. Only by adding in a supernatural event, which again is no different from God creating the world last Thursday, do we then lose our ability to make any inference about the past or make predictions about the future, because reality is fickle and it becomes this thing that you can't trust anymore.
Okay, but then can't you also end up with the same problem if you are determined to make things by natural processes? Meaning, like, no matter what, you can't accept any divine event, okay? Like, if you're determined. So that means no matter how, like, let's just say Now, okay, let's take the human brain, okay, which I was going to pick up my iPhone and try to say like, okay, but actually, let's just
really
do.
Gonna throw it at me.
No, but look, let's just do the human brain, because would you agree that a human brain is like better than an iPhone?
Some human brains. What do you mean? What do you mean the human brain is better than an iPhone? Like it's like what? It's more complicated. It's better at processing data. I don't know if that's true. I think iPhones might process data better than some of our brains. Yeah, it depends on.
Well, an iPhone isn't capable of taking in all kinds of information about the world around, processing and having all these things. So whatever is in the iPhone, we put into it, right? Like, so
yes. That is, yes.
Okay, so you would never, I'm assuming, you would never say that the iPhone came about by natural processes.
We're doing the paper thing again, though.
Yeah,
right?
but you would say that a human brain came about by natural processes, no matter how outlandish that is.
But
and from my perspective, that's the way. What you're doing is that you're limiting your possible explanations because you're determined to hold on to natural processes, even when natural processes are not capable of doing such a thing. But you're doing a circular reasoning where you're saying, but science is natural processes. Therefore, natural processes had to produce the brain. It had to be this way.
I'm not saying that at all. What I'm trying to say is that science is limited to making arguments and making hypotheses that are based on natural process. Now, it could be we don't know. Like let's say Darwin was never born, and we've presented and people never discovered evolution or whatever. Then like we would just be like, I don't know what did it. In exactly the same way we are with the origin of life. We don't know how the process happened, right? We investigate natural processes, like, because that's the hypotheses we can make. We can make natural hypotheses because those are the only ones we can test. But we don't have this grand narrative about the process of the origin of life outside of like floofy things that you read in pop science. But like the actual science, we don't know how it happened, right? And so like to me, we can say, I don't know what the natural process is. That doesn't mean there wasn't one. That doesn't mean that there is one. It just means you don't know. But we do have a good explanation for the origin of the human brain, right? We know where brains come from. We know where bodies come from. We know where molecules come from. We know where inheritance comes from. We have really good understandings of biological processes like that. We don't have to invoke supernatural things for things like brains.
Well, and see, that's where I'm going to disagree. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't pursue looking for natural processes. Like if we can find a natural process that can bring about a brain, that's awesome. And go for it. Like I encourage it. But so far, what I see in what, we can say evolution is capable of doing, I don't see the evolutionary processes capable of bringing about a brain.
I mean, your brain, right, was developed at some point. You started as a single cell and then grew, and then your brain developed. The ability for that to occur was in your DNA, right? Your DNA specified the ability of your body to then specify the specific tissue that would form your brain. Your DNA, you inherited from your parents, who got it from their parents, who got it from their parents, and it was a little different further and further back in time you go. Right? And if you go back in time and you trace the tree of life, you will find that you will coalesce with organisms with less complex brains and successively less complex brains until you coalesce with organisms that really don't have brains, they have nerve stems. And then you go a little bit further back and all that's left is like nerve ladders, right? And then you have like a single nerve strip. Like we have every single one of these successive steps if you just follow the tree of life back. But you won't do that because you have a religious presupposition that stops that tree arbitrarily at some point beyond last Thursday.
Well, now, so all of that, the story that you just told about the brains developing is a story that starts with the assumption of common ancestry. So
no, it's an inference from common ancestry based on the shared patterns of DNA, right? DNA is the shared inheritance. That's the mechanism of inheritance. We know the evolutionary mechanisms that generates a pattern, that generates a tree. So then we could say, okay, it looks like inheritance is common across life based on it being the material, and then based on the patterns of variation, can we now make sense of how the brain emerged, given that this is the pattern of inheritance we see? Sure enough, it looks like it could have emerged gradually following back through that tree that is observed. All you have to do is accept that the patterns of inheritance are real, that the DNA is real, and that it's like the material of inheritance is not arbitrary backwards in time. Then that just naturally follows from that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, though, the tree is not that nice and neat. You know what I mean? And so, like, that's the problem I was saying.
It's neater than you're giving it credit for. It's much, much neater than you're giving it credit for. And it's neat enough in the ways that would allow you to trace brains. Where it gets messy, and I'm very happy to talk. I did phylogenetics in graduate school and in phylogenetic method development. I'm very happy to talk phylogenetics. In the where the trees are messy, the trees are messy at tips, right? So closely related species, the tree gets messy because there's a lot of like introgression between species, lots of hybridization. That can go back only so far. But then once you get back, especially in animals and plants, once you get back beyond that like genus level, you stop seeing these big reticulations, and families start branching out much more cleanly. There's a few important exceptions. Passerine birds are a good exception, and angiosperms are a good exception. And the reason that these are two good exceptions is because the rapidity at which they emerged. And they both emerged right at big extinction events if you look at the fossil record. So they both correspond to like massive events where biodiversity was wiped out. So it seems like that diversity probably radiated so quickly because of like massive extinction events. But what these things are doing, these like incongruences in the trees are doing in these deeper nodes, it's what's called incomplete lineage sorting. And this is a thing that we have a theoretical explanation for going back to the 1970s. And it's the Coalescent predicts that there should be gene tree incongruence, especially when the nodes at speciation are very, very short. And we can predict when they should be, how much incongruence there should be, and what taxa should be most affected by incongruence. So we have a predictive framework of where we should find these things, and that's where we find them. The last big point of incongruence in phylogenetics is at the base of the tree, right? When you start going back to the bacteria, the archaea, and the early eukaryotes, that's when things really get messy, because you have horizontal gene transfer that's going on, particularly in bacteria, and then it's almost certainly the case that eukaryotes are probably the result of a fusion of a bacterial and archaeal cell, so that eukaryotes themselves have a really funky early tree. But what we're talking about here is bifurcation. We're talking about whether the tree is a bifurcating tree. And you can have like patterns of inheritance that don't have to be strictly bifurcating if you allow for things like horizontal gene transfer, which we know exists. We have a process and a mechanism as to why we should allow that to exist that we have observed, and we can account for it, right? So it's not messy in the sense that it like overthrows evolution, or evolution doesn't make sense of it, or evolution didn't predict that there should be messiness in the tree, because incomplete lineage sorting should absolutely exist. And I've prattled on for too long. I'll let you respond.
No, that's perfect. This is the kind of stuff that I wanted to hear, because, you know, this is stuff that a lot of people don't have this kind of information. So thank you for sharing that. But it's kind of like the incomplete lineage sorting. To me, it sounds like another patch. So like what I mean is
a mathematical theory. Like it's literally, if you accept Mendelian inheritance, which we already said you did, if you accept genetic drift, which I assume you do,
yes,
right? And you accept populations can split from each other. If all of those things are accept, and recombination, you also have to have recombination. Those things you accept, incomplete lineage sorting is a necessary thing that emerges from the math. It has to emerge. And we can predict the exact probabilities of the gene trees across the genome. And we've done this. I have a video on this. I don't know if you've seen it, but I have a video on this for human chimps and gorillas. And that in fact, using the incomplete lineage sorting model, you could predict exactly how many gene trees across the genome should be discordant. They should show humans and gorillas as one another's closest relative, and chimps and gorillas with humans as an outgroup. We know what that proportion should be, and it matches it exactly when you observe it. They are exact matches to the coalescent theory. That should not happen unless incomplete lineage sorting was really the explanation for the patterns of like genomic trees. So it's not a band-aid, it's literally a mathematical prediction from evolutionary theory that has been borne out in the data.
So what is it predicting? Like, what I mean is, like, just can you explain how is that a prediction, and how does evolution fulfill that prediction?
Yeah, okay, so it's kind of difficult to do it. This is maybe when I should have set up my little pen, because this is easier to do with a picture. It's hard to see in your head. So imagine you have a three-tip tree, right? There's only 3 different ways to arrange that tree. So you can have humans, chimps, gorillas as the outgroup. That's the tree that most of the genome matches, right? That's the tree that taken, whether or not you accept common ancestry, that's the tree that emerges from the pattern of DNA, right? Then you can also have humans, gorillas, and chimps, with chimps as the outgroup, humans and gorillas as one another's closest relatives, or you can have chimps and gorillas as one another's closest relative, humans as the outgroup. Do you see that in your head? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you can get that first tree in 2 different ways. You can get it because humans, and under universal common descent, you can get it in 2 ways. Humans and chimps coalesce. They find a common ancestor before they merge with gorillas back here. Okay? So they find a common ancestor, and then they come together with gorillas. They're in an ancestral population, and they merge. That's one way to get it. The second way to get it is you have humans, chimps. They don't merge in that little interval. Gorillas join. They're all in an ancestral population, and then humans and chimps join. We call this deep coalescence. But it still generates the correct tree. It's just deeper in the past. Okay? So that's 2 ways that you can get the quote-unquote right gene tree. The other 2 ways, if universal common descent is true, you can only get those 2 one way. You can get chimps and gorillas for those 2 to join together. If the true tree is human, chimp, and gorilla, that means that chimps and gorillas, humans and chimps didn't coalesce in this interval. They were all in an ancestral population, and instead of chimps merging with humans, they merged with gorillas, right? That's one way that could happen. The same is true with the humans and gorillas. They just went back, humans merged with gorillas before they did with chimps. So those are the 2 incongruent trees. And they happen in exactly the same way, which means the probability that they occur is exactly the same. So you should see far more of the first tree that I talked about, because there's 2 ways in which you can get that first tree. And you should see less of the other 2 trees, and they should occur in equal frequencies, because there's only the same way to get those 2 trees. Do you follow me?
I don't follow you, but I'll go back and listen to it.
Okay. I'm sorry.
It's not your
really
fault.
hard to see. It's so hard to see it in your head. You really need a picture.
And you said you have a video on this, right?
I do have a video on this.
Okay.
So if people are interested, and if what I just said didn't make any sense, watch the video, or just like Google pictures of incomplete lineage sorting. Pictures are really, really helpful for this. But the point, really the big takeaway here, what I'm trying to get across is that what we call the species tree, this is the quote unquote true tree, human chimps with gorillas as the outgroup, should be the most common tree you find in the genome, right? Everybody accepts that that's true. Everybody accepts that that's the pattern that you see. That's a big whoop. Who cares? That's not the interesting thing. What the interesting thing is the frequencies of the discordant trees, the 2 trees that are the least common, the less common trees. Under universal common descent, the only way to get those 2 trees is if they all occurred in a common population, so they should occur with equal frequency. When you look at the human genome, what you find is that it's like 76% of all the genomic regions correspond with the species tree, and then like 11 and like 11.5 correspond to the other 2 trees. They are in roughly equal frequencies. This can only be explained, in my mind, I don't know how common design can explain this. Those 2 discordant trees being in equal frequencies is exactly what is predicted under coalescent theory, was predicted in the 1970s, long before we had this data, And then we got this data, and it matched that prediction exactly. I don't know how common descent or common design can explain that pattern.
Well, okay, and there's portions of what you're explaining that I don't understand, so I will go back and listen to it to try to get an understanding. But I'll just tell you why this doesn't sound to me like evidence for common ancestry is because, like, we've already grouped these animals together, like, by our shared traits. Like, why did we ever think humans and chimps had a common ancestor? Could it be because there's a lot we share in common? Like, why didn't we say humans and butterflies had a most recent common ancestor, right? Like, what, like, why aren't they butterflies are common ancestor? Because they're very different. But so that is like, but just because we share similarities with a chimp, right, it doesn't mean that we have a common ancestor. So under common design, we just have commonalities. That's the animal that we are closest with, right? And then the same could be said for gorillas. Okay, we might not share quite as much similarity with them, but none of this actually shows that we have common ancestry. Like, it's an assumption to say that all of those go back to common ancestry, right?
I think we missed what I was trying to get across. So because it's actually not about the fact that humans and chimps are most related. It's actually the discordant trees that matter. That's the because we both agree on the parts that match, right? We agree that humans and chimps are the most similar, but there are regions of your genome where you are more similar to a gorilla than you are to a chimp. Okay. And there's some parts of your genome where or some parts of chimps' genomes where they're more similar to gorillas than they are to humans. The question is why is that the case? This is the discordant stuff you were talking about before. And like we were talking about, like, why is incomplete lineage sorting a thing that we care about? And why is that not just a Band-Aid? And the reason is that it explains those discordant trees. And it predicts that those discordant trees, where I'm more related to a gorilla than a chimp, where most of my genome I'm more related to a chimp, it says that should happen as frequently in my genome as it happens in the chimp's genome to be more related to the gorilla, right? That those discordant trees should be equal to each other across the genome. And that's only true if there was once a common ancestral population in which lineages that would eventually become human, eventually become chimp, and eventually become gorilla were all present at the same time. That's the only way to get that pattern.
Why is that the only way to get that pattern?
Because I don't like what's another way in which you would have equal distributions of those two trees without common descent? Like do you know? I don't know. I've really thought about this. I don't know another way to get that pattern.
Well, what exactly are we talking about? Equal number of mutations? What are we talking about when we say the discordance? The amount of different, like, mutations in the gene?
When you align the gene, like when you take a certain region of the genome and you align it, right? So you say humans, chimps, gorillas, you align them, and then you count the differences. And you say, okay, for most of the genome, humans and chimps have fewer differences than they do to gorillas, right? That's how you're building trees in effect, right? And so, but sometimes when you do that, you're like, oh my gosh, humans and gorillas have fewer differences than they do with chimps. What's going on, right? And the proportions in which you find that are equal in the tree to the proportions in which you find, like, chimps and gorillas are more related than they are to humans, right? Those are the two, what we call discordant. Those are the trees that don't match what the rest of the genome shows. Does that make sense? Do you follow that?
Well, I'm not seeing how that helps the common ancestry case. I mean,
it's explained by coalescent theory that is explaining incomplete lineage sorting, right? That's my...
Which, again, to me, it sounds like a way of helping patch a problem. But I totally admit here, I am probably totally missing it. So maybe that's a good place to stop because we're almost at 2 hours. So how about, I mean, look, and I won't ask you to make a commitment to coming back on right now, but I'll just say, I'm going to go look into this coalescence theory and figure out what you're talking about, okay? Because I think I can't talk about it until I understand it. So that'll be my project.
Yeah,
so thank you.
I've also written technical papers on this. If I have a paper called Phylogenetics in Space where I go through coalescent theory. If that's a thing you might be interested in, I have videos where maybe it's like a little bit more at a level that you might understand, that are like easier for people to understand. It's a complex idea and it's mathematical. It's a mathematical idea that emerges from drift, population isolation, and recombination. Like if those three things are true, incomplete lineage sorting emerges as a necessity from those three things. So yeah, just watch the video. I think it's called Phylogenetics Discordance Supports Common Ancestry, something like that. It was one of my first videos, so you have to go back pretty far, and I apologize for like audio quality. Like it's an old video.
Okay, I will do that. Do you want to take audience questions, or do you feel like it's too much tonight? We've already gone too far.
We can take a couple. We're at 1:55, so let's try to end it at 2 hours or 2
okay.
But I could take a couple.
Okay, actually, I think it's probably better to just stop and say, look, audience, thank you so much for being here. And I'm sorry that I didn't get to questions. And, but really, thank you so much for being here. Hope you enjoyed it. And I know I enjoyed it. Like, this was really great. So thank you, Dr. Hancock, for being on here. It was really awesome talking to you. And I hope we can do it again. Do you have any final words?
Yeah, I'll just say I also had a really good time. This was a fun conversation. I don't get to have these conversations very often, and them be very cordial, right? So it was very nice that we could just talk about this in a human, cordial way. That was really fun. I really enjoyed that. And yeah, again, like my purpose here is not to, I want to make clear my purpose here is not to, I don't know, spread the gospel of atheism or materialism or something. I like, people can believe whatever they want. I have nothing against religion. I'm not one of those kinds of people. And I believe that you can be an evolutionary biologist and be a Christian. I don't think those things are in conflict. I think people interpret the word in many different ways, and the way they experience their religion is outside of my understanding. But I'm not here to critique that. I'm just here to try to promote science and like evolution education.
Yes, and actually that's something we agree on. Look, you can be a Christian and believe in evolution. You can be a Christian evolutionary biologist. In fact, I have interviewed two Christian evolutionary biologists before. So I totally believe that as well. And so, but for me, I do care about this topic because I do think people have been deceived into believing that they've come about by natural processes. And that does make it harder to see the creator. And so I definitely am sharing the gospel that God loves you. And so anyway, whether you
I lost this. I can't